Hi, everyone. It's great to be live here with you for the next 30 minutes talking about the highest standard in AI. I am Dania Meida. I am a founding member of the AI Guild, the go-to community for data and business professionals advancing AI adoption. Welcome to all of you who are joining us live. Please be an active member and write any questions you have for us on the chat. We will try our best to answer them. Today with me is Joris Krijger. He's an AI Guild member based in the Netherlands. Joris works as an ethics and AI specialist at the Dutch bank, the Volksbank, while also holding a Ph.D. position at the Erasmus University Rotterdam on the same topic. Currently, he is doing research on the operationalization of ethical principles in organizational context, and he also holds an editorial board member position for Springer's AI and Ethics journal. Thank you for joining me for the fireside chat about AI ethics.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
To get started, sure. To get started, would you like to share with us how you got to where you are today?
Sure, yeah. I think it is a little bit of an unusual route. I have a background in economic psychology and in philosophy, and I did a bachelor's in media studies. And I was always fascinated by the topic of technology and ethics. And later on, I became interested in finance as well. And at a certain point, after I wrote my master's thesis on perhaps the effect of technology on moral responsibility, in particular in finance, I had the opportunity to join a bank, the Volksbank, to give advice on the fair use or the responsible use of algorithms. And I thought that's really interesting. That's a really interesting opportunity. But I really wanted to do some academic and theoretical work with it. And so I chose for a construction, a bit of a hybrid construction, where I tried to get a function as a PhD at the Erasmus University Rotterdam and a function at the Volksbank. And fortunately, they agreed to this sort of complicated structure, where I would, both in an academic setting and in a practical setting, look at the question of how can we actually operationalize and implement these often high-level ethical principles for AI. There are a lot of frameworks, a lot of principles out there. I believe at this moment there are over 200 different guidelines for the ethical or responsible use of AI.
Wow.
And the question I started out with is, how can we bring these abstract, high-level guidelines into practice? What does it mean? What things do you encounter when you try to operationalize them? And what is actually expected of organizations when it comes to operationalizing these sort of frameworks? So that's where I'm currently working on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing this, because I come from the perspective of the technology. So I am a data scientist. We have a lot of people from the AI Guild who are also data scientists. And now we hear a lot more about AI ethics. And like you mentioned, I didn't know there were so many, like more than 200 different frameworks. Yes, we kind of are bombarded with all this information now, which, to be honest, like from the math and computer science background, this is something different, right? And we read about it, and of course we take responsibility on the code that we write, the outcomes of this code. Though there is really this gap, between what are the ethical principles, or like in theory, what is the responsibility, and how can you put that in practice on like your everyday work. So I am interested to learn from you what you have been doing, like what have you learned from doing this, let's say the insider experience, and yeah, what else can you tell people like me who are from the technology side, or like developers and data scientists? How can we also become more involved in those conversations inside the organization?
Yeah, very good questions. And I think you already mentioned something very important, like what is the responsibility of data scientists in the implementation of ethics, or the ethical use or responsible use of AI. And I think that's one of the first questions I started out with, because when you look at the principles, but also perhaps at assessments available currently, AI impact assessments and so on, they primarily tend to focus on the data scientist. And one of the first things that I learned was that if you really want to operationalize and implement ethics, this is not the sole concern or the sole responsibility of the data scientist. I mean, data scientists are the most knowledgeable in their domain, but the ethical decisions, the moral decision making, shouldn't just be delegated to data scientists because they are the most knowledgeable. And so this is one of the first insights that I started with. And this was also a request from the data scientists within the organization as well. They were saying, like, should we be the persons ultimately responsible for deciding what is fair or not, or when something is explainable enough or not? That shouldn't be up to us, and it should be a broader organizational decision. So I took this position, or this insight, as the basis of my PhD research as well. Because when you look at what is published on ethics and technology, it's all focused on technological design, on code, on metrics. But I think the most interesting part comes, ethically speaking, once you have these metrics in place, for example, and you learn that there are 21 different definitions of fairness. They can all be measured within your data set in the outcomes. But the question then becomes, what do we think is fair? What is the most appropriate metric for fairness given a certain context? And I think these contextual aspects and these sort of organizational dimensions really are understudied currently. And that's why I'm trying to explore what can be done on AI ethics from an organizational perspective. And so the first thing I learned, the first insight then, is that it shouldn't be just up to the data scientist to decide these sorts of things. The second thing is then, what should you do and where should you focus on? And I thought, well, I learned that you have to really embed ethics, not just in the design process, but in the structures and processes and systems of the organization itself. So we started out with trying all sorts of ethics boards, all sort of ethics assessments. And we found, well, these have pros and cons. But one of the most important things we found out was that you actually need to have some sort of a governance framework in place and some sort of a guidance framework in place. And to start with the letter, the guidance framework really is about training data scientists to be aware of the societal impact, the ethical impact their systems are having or can potentially have. Because this is not a given. And often when you talk to compliance and integrity officers, for example, they assume that data scientists or anyone within an organization will come up to them with ethical dilemmas and they will help them solve these ethical dilemmas. But signaling an ethical dilemma or signaling the ethical impact of something you're working on can be very difficult. So I think the first step is making data scientists aware and giving them tools to actually see the impact their systems can have in society at large. So this is something we came up with, a training system for the guidance of data scientists. And the next thing you need to have, because once you are aware of these ethical aspects, you need some way to resolve the ethical tensions that can emerge within a specific design. And so we came up with a governance framework, which is really about being aware and taking conscious decisions on the value trade-offs that you face when you are, for example, developing a system that should do credit risk scoring, which is in banking, of course, highly relevant. You don't want to structurally disadvantage a certain group. You don't want to exacerbate existing disparities. And then you meet all these sorts of tensions within the design. For example, we want it to be fair, but we also want it to be accurate and performing well. So if we place some sort of fairness constraints on the model, this will mean that it will be less accurate. And also that perhaps we take on as a bank more risk, which can be costly in the long term. So these are sort of ethical dilemmas that we face when we are developing these sort of systems, and deciding whether we should opt for fairness or for accuracy or find some sort of compromise between those two. That's not a job of data scientists. That's something perhaps to be decided by senior management. And so what we did was build a governance framework where we can, first of all, document these sort of value decisions and these sorts of value conflicts that we find in technological design. And then second of all, be able to sort of give, not just say we should do this or we shouldn't do this, but to come up with some sort of options for developers to bring their design, either the model or the process, more in line with the ethical principles that we agreed on. So we are not saying you cannot do this and you shouldn't do this, but we're just saying how can you make this system better. And if it's really terrible, but I haven't encountered that yet, we say perhaps you shouldn't do this, or go back to the drawing table. But where we stand, we have been working with this method for 1.5 years now, and we've learned quite a lot about what is the best way to approach this. And we usually find that data scientists are quite enthusiastic about this as well, because they make these sort of value decisions. And I found that a lot of them already have, of course, the best of intentions when they are developing these sorts of systems. And so what we are doing is we're bringing out these value conflicts, these value decisions that we are making. We are documenting those in what is called Morris prudence. So we have a collection of value decisions for specific use cases and specific systems that we developed. And we can justify and morally motivate the value decisions that we took in the design process. And we have some form of governance to see if we're consistent in that, if we're doing the right thing, if we're following the right procedures. And so these are important, I think, organizational aspects that we have to start looking at if we really want to implement these ethical principles. Just focusing on the design and just having a discussion with data scientists will not do it if you're serious about operationalizing ethics.
Thank you. That was very informative, and I can see that you have really it was a journey, right? So like you described, 1.5 years trying it out, seeing how it works, and how can you actually make it as a process so it doesn't depend on one person or one job function in the company, but it's really across the company, and the organization understands that this is a process and it needs governance. I like it. So if I understood it right, you would say the first step is to be aware, to create awareness. So I believe that this part is where we are with our AI Guild community, because we have been talking about this. I mean, our mission is to advance AI adoption for the benefit of humanity. So we do want to use technology to make life better for everyone. And we take responsibility on what we do, but of course, we are not working in a vacuum, right? So we do work inside an organization, and there is all the context around us. And even if we are aware, we make the others around us aware, that doesn't necessarily do it. So that is the first step. And then on your second step, you described all of these, of the idea of documenting it. So raising the topics and then documenting it and figuring out options for solutions. And all of this under the umbrella of the ethical aspects that the organization already agreed upon. So then it's not really per use case, but it's more overview on a high level of the organization. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right in that. And I think the interesting thing, and that's always, of course, with abstract and high level principles, is that they only get their meaning and moral significance in specific contexts. And when we discuss, for example, fairness, we see that when we discuss fairness in the credit risk context, it's totally different than when we discuss fairness in the context of fraud detection or detecting money laundering. Because we still have this principle of fairness, we still value it, but it's valued differently in different contexts. And I think that's what is the shortcoming of general and abstract principles, but also what makes them interesting, and why you need governance to actually have a consistent value decision policy and structure in place.
Yes. Okay. I have another question about this, going more into the aspect of the financial services where you are included. But we also got a question from the chat. So thank you for sending this question. So what tools would allow to anticipate or see the impact? I'm assuming here the impact of applying those sort of ethical guidelines and governance.
Yes, or the impact, the societal impact of your AI systems. And I will answer them both just to be sure. So to start with the latter, there are quite some open source tools available to, for example, determine the fairness, to find some sort of fairness score on your data set or on your outcomes. and also some open source tools for explainability, for example. And although this might not give you a full view of the impact the system will eventually have, and here I return to the point of contextuality. I mean, it depends on the context in which this system is embedded, what the actual impact will be. But you can make some sort of estimation on what the impact of the AI system will be. And I think when you look at the new regulation, the AI EU Act, it also focuses on this risk differentiation. And even though there's no simple heuristic to determine what is high risk, or what is mid risk, or what is low risk, there are some clear indications of when something can be considered high risk, or when you should treat it as a high risk. And so what we basically do, we look at the impact it can potentially have on, for example, a customer, employee, the bank, or society in general. And on the basis of that, determine what the impact or the likely impact will be. So I think when you look at the impact of AI systems, it is of course subjective, but there are some elements to that subjectivity that we can all agree on. That, for example, when you say credit risk scoring, access to credit is really important to the possibilities for you to pursue your own goals, to live your own life. So I think we can agree that that is a high impact application. When you, for example, structurally disadvantage certain groups in the access to credit, you're creating a social disparity that is highly undesirable. So I think even though it will always remain to some extent subjective, we can agree on what is high impact or high risk. So I think that would be my answer when it comes to anticipating the impact of AI systems themselves. Now, if you want to look at the impact of the ethical principles on the structures and processes you have in place, we did that as well. We started out with the principles and agreeing on the principles. As I said, that's probably the easiest part because there are so many of them, and you just can do some cherry picking on which suit your organization best, for example. But we agreed on some principles, and then we just looked at the model inventory that we had. And even though it did not include all the models that we have within the bank, we could get a fair estimation of what the impact of fully implementing these principles would be, or where, for example, tension would arise if we try to implement them. And I gave you the example of credit risk scoring. Fairness is important there. And so we just wrote down that implementing these principles will probably have a high impact on the way we will do credit risk scoring. And that's sort of the first impact assessment that we did of these principles, just being aware what will likely change, where will these principles have the most impact, and what do we consider desirable there. So that would be another way to go about assessing the impact.
Yes, and this is when I really wanted to ask you regarding the context. So we agree the context for the system is pretty much what is going to take it from this high level of overview or the abstract to more concrete and concrete examples. And then if we talk about the financial services, you already brought some examples there. And this is also easy to see even if you're not working for a bank, because everyone has a bank account and you know what kind of things the bank can offer you. And if you stop and think about why are they offering me this, or why are they not offering me that, those questions start to arise. We had a recent example as well, if I'm not mistaken, was a couple that they have the joint bank account, they have everything, it should be the same, but then one is a man and one is a woman, and they got different offers. So it showed basically on the results. You don't need to know anything about AI. But yeah, this aspect now that you are mentioning, okay, we understand what are the principles, we agreed on them. Maybe that is the easiest part, but still it takes effort, right? It takes time, and it's also preventing organizations from using AI, because then they really have to have this conversation before. And I see that one of the biggest motivations they will have to do it now, at least in the EU, is the upcoming AI Act that will make them more, because there is a regulation now, they have to look at this. And then comes the question here that I was thinking in the background, and then we also got it from the chat. So thank you for sending this question. What is the bottleneck of operationalizing AI ethics in an organization? You have to have buy-in, you have to create policies. I also thought about this second aspect you mentioned. After agreeing on the the principles, then you have to assess what use cases it will impact, and it will have a lot of conflicts of interest that will arise. We know it. We have heard now recently there are tensions in the big tech companies in the US, like
Mhm.
Google, and also on Facebook. So, can you tell us a bit more from your experience, what you have seen, and maybe what are kind of the lessons that you learned?
Yeah, right. I think that's again a very relevant question. What is the bottleneck? And in a sense, I think there are multiple challenges when you're trying to implement ethics for AI. And I think if I had to point out one particular challenge that I think is difficult, or what makes it difficult, is that the ethical aspects of AI are somewhat of an undefined role. I mean, compliance, for example, at least in our organization, said, well, perhaps this is too technical for us, and the data scientists themselves already indicated, well, these are ethical elements that shouldn't just be decided by us as data scientists. So it's really hard to point out whose responsibility is the ethical aspects of AI. And often you get, well, what's referred to as the problem of many hands, of course, that probably everyone assumes that, well, the data scientist will tackle this, and the data scientist will think, well, probably we have policies in place that will check for these ethical aspects, and in the end nothing gets done. So in the bank as well, we had to start with sort of a new team, an ethics office we called it, which specifically concerned itself with the ethical aspects of our algorithms and models, just because there was no a party already or department where we could give this responsibility to do. So we said, well, we'll just start with it ourselves, and then we see where it ends up, whether it's a legal thing or a compliance thing. But I think that can be an important challenge, just determining who's responsible for the ethical aspects of our AI systems. That can be a bottleneck. And of course, for that, you need to buy in from higher ups. You need to have the policy in place. But I think the actual responsibility that comes with implementing AI ethics can be the most challenging in the first steps. And then, of course, after you have this team in place, you bring up these value conflicts. You get all these sorts of ethical challenges. Then you need, of course, also some form of a strong mandate to actually make decisions in favor of these ethical principles, because just discussing them can be nice, and it can give you a warm feeling because we are doing good. Nobody is against
Yeah.
world peace. But when it actually comes with a cost to implement the principles such as fairness or explainability, somebody has to decide and take the responsibility to say, okay, look, we're not going to do this this way, but we're going to focus on the explainability, and we're going to use a less complex model just because it is more interpretable, for example, even though it might cost us something in the accuracy of the system. And I think that's the next step, to actually integrate it in the decision-making procedure and have people in place that can take these sorts of decisions and actually can give some meaning to these ethical principles.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the thorough answer, because indeed there are multiple challenges depending on the level that the organization is in this journey. Because in the end, it is a journey, and I think that, I mean, AI is still a pretty new field. Then on top of it, coming with those sort of philosophical questions makes it more convoluted. But it's not something that we can look away from, right? I mean, it is impacting people's lives every day. So this is a hard conversation to have, or hard decisions to be made. And it makes a lot of sense that we do have to understand that besides the policies and all the awareness, there needs to be responsibility.
Right. And what I
Someone
always
needs
say
to
is
own
that
this.
that it's more costly to ignore this topic than to actually address it, because of course it might bring up some hard questions, it might bring up some difficult dilemmas, but ignoring these issues, and for example, can lead to, I don't know, reputational damage, but also to something called technical debt, where you have to rebuild a system even though it's already in production, because these ethical problems emerge. And I think that anticipating also the legislation and these sort of ethical challenges beforehand, it's not just something, it's not just a nice to have, so to say, it's a need to have. if you want to be effective, if you want to have a good AI processes, you need to include these ethical aspects as well, not just for the sake of ethics, but even if you're a profit-oriented organization, you need to have this. And we've seen this with the Swillow case as well in the United States, the real estate organization, of course. And there you can already hear some people saying, well, perhaps in the due diligence, investors should also check how these data science processes are structured and governed. And so I think there's also a business case, if you will, to be made for ethics, even though it shouldn't be the sole purpose to do ethics, because I think ultimately we should be accountable towards stakeholders. We should do what is best from a stakeholder perspective and not just from a shareholder perspective. But I think from all these stakeholders, for everyone, a case is to be made to implement ethics and address these difficult questions rather than ignoring them and keeping them a blind spot.
Yes, thank you. I really like this. And yes, we do have some minutes left. So before we go, I would ask you to share maybe some resources or tell people how they can find more about about what you are, the work you are developing now. No? So maybe this conversation is just the introduction for the topic, and people want to follow up. So what would you advise, or what would you point them to?
I think, yeah, that's a really interesting question, because as I was saying, the field of the organizational dimension of these ethical aspects of AI is quite understudied. So what I'm reading right now is more political philosophy books, if you will. So, for example, reading something from Sen or from Rawls. And I think I would be really curious to hear, if people are interested in the topic of ethics, what I think of these more traditional philosophical authors and how they see how these views perhaps could align with the work they are doing. Because there's still a lot to explore. And as you say, it's a journey, and there's no perfect answer. I mean, what we do at the bank, it's just one way to deal with ethics. And it's not the perfect way, perhaps, but it is at least a way to deal with ethics. And I would be really curious to hear if people start reading these books of ethics, for example, from Michael Sandel, Rawls, these sort of authors, these traditional ethical authors. I would be really interested to hear how they see how this sort of literature fits in with the work they are doing, and perhaps also the decisions they are now making in their data science processes. Because I think we have to do this in a sort of dialogue. I mean, I work at the university and at the bank. And the most important part for me is the conversation, the interaction, and learning from data scientists what is possible and what isn't possible. Because as I said earlier, when I walked into the bank with these all these sorts of principles under my arm, saying to the data scientists, "Oh, hello," saying to the data scientists, "Look, you have to do something with these principles." They immediately said to me, like, how do we formalize this? What does this mean? What is fairness? What is justice? And how should we go about implementing these in our design? What do they mean for our model, for our code? And I think that's something you can only find out through conversation, through interaction, because we don't have accepted standards yet. We don't have a lot of best practices yet. It's something we're still working on, something I'm still working on. So I'd be curious to hear how other people go about this, how other people feel or think about this, because at this point, I think the conversation is the most important strategy and approach to actually do something in this field. So by all means, if you're interested, reach out to me via LinkedIn, for example, and I'd be happy to continue the chat and hear your thoughts and ideas.
Cool. Yes, this is really, really aligned with what we are doing exactly now. So this is a conversation that we start, and we sure want to continue this. Also, those are the conversations that we have between our practitioner community, and it is really interesting to hear from others that are doing this, like you said, between university, between organizations, and really expanding the conversation now with more people so that we can talk about this, because also to accomplish this mission that we have to advance AI adoption, one of the things that we are working on at the AI Guild is to come up with standards. And it's not something that one person just comes up with by themselves. Like this requires conversations and hearing from different people that are in different contexts, that have different perspectives. So I'm really glad that you joined for the conversation. I had a really good time. Thank you for being with us now. And yes, thank you for anyone watching. Thank you for spending some time of your lunch break with us. It was very insightful. And if you're watching the recording, next time, please join us live every Wednesday at 12:30 noon. Hope to see you soon. Thank you again, Joris.
Thanks.